As you know, we are in a politically charged environment. And not only, a lot of times things would happen politically, and we think about it in regards to our participants. But it's also some of the laws are politically affecting researchers because of, Texas and Florida. So, and probably a couple other things in Missouri. So, one of the things we wanted to talk about and have an open discussion about is kind of conducting research in these politically charged environments. And sometimes laws or bills or just the climate have direct implications on the research you do, but also sometimes there's some indirect implications on the research you do and some kind of downstream impacts. So some of the areas which are in the crosshairs, and I use crosshairs specifically thinking about some of the gun violence and the work we're doing to just kind of remind us about that, is transgender research, abortion, reproductive rights, immigration and migration. You can take out immigration and migration health, criminal justice, indigenous populations, diversity and inclusion, D&I is under effect, hate crimes and discrimination, as well as gun violence. So these are just some areas I thought of that's kind of, politically charged right now. I may have missed some because it becomes very, I don't know, like the list is getting so freaking long at this point. Like, this is ridiculous, but this is where we're at. So some of the things I thought we would kind of think about as we go through this, but even to, pop off some conversation now, is what can we learn from our experience? This was Sue brought this up earlier. What can we learn from our experiences in some of the early on HIV research when HIV was very politically, or it is, but back in the day, it was very criminalized, very
and just for people who weren't in the room yesterday with Cynthia's talk, she gave a whole history of this, which so some of you are very familiar now with this history.
And there's also the question, a lot of us, we get into this research because of our views, our personal views and what we identify and how I stand as a person. But, are we a researcher or are we an activist? And kind of that we have to keep, I personally think we have to keep that separate, or not. I don't know. I try to keep it separate. Are we a researcher or an activist? And how will this impact what research now won't get done? We talk about who we won't include into a population and thinking about that from not only a D&I disparity, but also an equity. And we're going to talk about like some of the ethical principles of that. So some of the impacts too, and this is hopefully going to be more of a discussion than just a talking head, but some of the impacts to research. One is kind of in the informed consent. We are going to have to think about the environment that we are in. And as we write the informed consent, we need to make sure that we are really talking about the political and the potential legal and social risk of our research and making sure we articulate that to our participants. And we might want to include things about, disclosure, potential social harms. We need to talk about these in our informed consent and ensuring that participants fully understand the risks before consenting and being in the research. And there's also a step before this of, are IRBs and Office of Research Services going to allow certain things because of the implications and ramifications. But in thinking about this, a lot of informed consents, a lot of places have these boilerplates. I think that while they may tell you like, oh, here's the boilerplate, if you're working with a population or in a topic that needs more protection, you need to talk, I would say you need to talk to the IRB and say, I want to add this. This is what you typically say. This is not necessarily true for what's going on right now, and augment. So one of the other impacts I think we have to think about is the confidentiality of our data and the privacy and safety of and we should take extra precautions when we're handling, when we're asking questions, and when we're storing data. Things can be coded, right? You can make codes, you can anonymize data, there's secure platforms, and I mentioned obtaining a certificate of confidentiality, but I give you a little caveat, your mileage may vary. the certificate of confidentiality should protect, for example, reproductive rights data and abortion data, but it may not protect, or I don't think there's anything in it saying it's going to protect the researcher. So again, these are, I don't want this to be like a fear or people to start thinking about changing their research or avoiding doing certain populations. You need to talk to your institution and move forward on this. But one of the things, for example, like we and my team, we're taking precautions on, we're thinking about a little bit of like this idea of a digital ID, so that we actually never really do know who a person is, that they have a unique code and a unique ID that they set up on, this anonymizer, and that is how we do it, and that is how they get paid. So even if anything, I don't think anyone can ask, well, there is Freedom of Information Act. I don't believe it doesn't include data, but so just in case if I was asked or whatever, some kind of way, or maybe a collaborator, that we can have some different ways, but thinking about ways for security and protecting our participants. We talked about mandatory reporting a lot in multiple sessions. So I just wanted to bring it up again here. I mean, I was really thinking more about the gender affirming care, but also you have the risk of a person could talk about that they had an abortion or that they're pregnant, and then the next time they come in, they're not pregnant. Things like that. So this one right here is near and dear. We a lot of times when we do our costs, we do fill this part out of the protocol, the risk, the benefit, the cost, the risk benefit analysis. I have been guilty myself of using a little bit of boilerplate from the year before or this protocol before. There's no risk. You may feel a little emotional horror when you get asked certain questions. I think let's take more time. Maybe other people are already taking time, but take a little more time being thoughtful about the risk benefit analysis that you do, and then thinking about how can I make sure I reduce the risk to my participant and increase the benefits, or definitely reduce the risk. And you can do that by the way you ask questions, the way you code data. You can do it by some of your other methodologies of how you collect information. We could start thinking about different ways you can design parts of the study which maybe are anonymous, and parts of the study which are, where you do get other types of data, and what that would mean for data, analyzing the data. But just thinking about like really paying attention to the risk benefit analysis, and as well as when you do it. And one of the questions, like I really wanted to, I don't know if this applies to a lot of the MRPs, but I think it applies to you as a researcher and to us as a research community, is do we need to update who is included in vulnerable populations in the concept of being able to protect them? And I don't know, like, is this something that, should transgender, and I hate the word vulnerable, but should transgender adolescents now be included in having extra protections? Because I don't know, many of the states are actively against them. When I'm thinking of, like the idea of vulnerability, I'm thinking about the idea that we say this group, we stand up, this is, I guess we do become a little bit of activists, right? We stand up and say this group these groups are important. We want to study these groups, and we are going to ensure that we can study these groups by enacting certain safeguards of protecting their data and protecting them and protecting the researchers that do this research. It's a different lens, I think, of looking at the way the federal regs use the word vulnerability. But I think my biggest fear is that research won't get done because we're all afraid, and good reasons to be afraid, and participants to be afraid.
Well, this is more of a question. As I mentioned, I'm not sort of history. When this happened with HIV, we felt that our data would be protected in a way so we could protect the data. And what we were trying to do is avoid people searching for our type of data, which is why we changed all the titles, didn't use certain words, because that's how the politicians and people were searching for those things. So we didn't stop what we were doing. We simply made it very difficult for those folks that are trying to highlight it not make it easy for them. And so the protection really was in how do we protect the data? That was the focus, right? But not so much to stop us from doing the work. And I do worry and wonder, if people are going to not do the work, or can we find other ways to involve these different populations without labeling them? I mean, that's, so it's more of a question.
Yeah, I mean, the transgender issue with children, it's not, if you're working with adults, there's nothing you have to report, right? But if you're working with children, how do we find out if they are transgender? Because we have our questions, right, of what was the, sex assigned at birth, and then what gender are you? Yeah.
I want to suggest something that I think if you talk to, and this could be an MRP for next year, if you know somebody, if you talk to any member of these populations that are listed or unlisted here, I would bet that they would tell you that this is just the 100th huge risk they face. I think the risk that has changed is the risk to providers and by extension to researchers. And I've done work with transgender youth in various places. Their lives aren't measurably worse right now because of this.
That's true.
Their lives are measurably worse because of the history. And it goes for everyone group on this. What's changed is now we are at risk, right? And that's what's different, that their risks, their lives are risky. If you want to use the term risk or whatever, there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world. And this is just another of the 100th ones. And so I think the issue is that, and there's an existential risk that you pointed out here, that if research stops, we're in a lot of trouble, because the only way that we're going to address the risks is over a long time by getting an evidence base and hopefully getting that evidence base out to society so things maybe change a little bit. So that's a huge risk, but that's not a risk they would experience in their day-to-day lives.
So in the other part, like right here, this one, justice, and thinking about if we end up with, I'm not trying to do the sky is falling, but if we end up with a situation where we can do certain research in certain states and not research in other states, we aren't getting the whole, you're not getting all social determinants of health, right? You're not getting a full picture of that population, what they're going through. And it just really, it really impacts research, and it impacts the generalizability, the voices, all of the things that we know. And so, figuring out ways to do research on, these politically charged topics in every area of the US is important.
So let me ask a question. What if, moving on with what Lloyd was saying, what if the IRB says, you're working with an adolescent population, we don't think you should ask, about whether or not they're transgender. What, is Lloyd's explanation sufficient? What can, I work with adolescents all the time, so what, is that a sufficient explanation to those who work on an IRB? Are they gonna say, that's right?
I'm concerned that studies that would have previously been expeditable because they meet the minimum risk
They're
definition
on full board.
and they meet one of the categories, but they have to meet the minimal risk definition. And the risk for participation might be greater than not the risk of a transgender adolescent's normal life, but a cisgendered person. That the normal person, not the person, it's not the risk of cancer treatment for a cancer patient, it's the risk of cancer treatment for me. So everything is greater than minimal risk. So I'm concerned about the interpretation of the minimal risk definition for some of these, what you're calling vulnerable populations. I wish we had another
I wish
word
we did.
because of the regulatory definition. So be careful when you use.
So I think one thing you could use, if we want to use the minimal risk definition, you could say, issues regarding gender and sex are part of normal medical pediatric questions.
But the risk
I understand.
to a transgender adolescent is greater, revealing something in certain environments, certain states, than.
But that's always been true.
That's always been
Yes,
true.
that's been true before these.
But now there's a legal risk.
Right, but
Before it was a social risk, a stigma risk, or reportability.
There's no legal risk to the adolescent. There's
Well,
legal risk
I'm
to
just,
all
I'm
of us.
pulling that, I'm thinking, I mean,
To their
because of
parents.
my world, I'm thinking of
There-
abortion
Right,
issues.
be legal risk to their parents.
And there are new
that's right.
risks.
I mean, I don't, sorry, I don't 100% agree with you, Lloyd. I think that you know, these laws are really extreme in certain places.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if a person were to disclose, I'm on, receiving treatment that now in Texas is
Yeah.
child abuse, and you are now mandated to report their parents as child abuse. That's a risk that was not there before law. Like, their lives are still equally hard,
Right.
but it's a different arena, and I think you're getting at that. Like, sorry, is it?
No, I think
No,
that's
that's
a
a
great
good point.
point. That's a context in which the risk of research is greater than perhaps, I have no idea what the physician has to do, but the risks of research are pretty serious. If we know
Also-
they're on puberty blockers because somebody gave it to them,
And,
right? But we don't know if the parent gave it.
and one of
But
the,
anyhow, but you're absolutely right. So what do you do with the
Well-
IRB? Because we can go to what, 4.0. 1, 2, 3, 4.03, right? 4.03, which is greater than minimal risk, but necessary to protect the. res-
Five or.
Well,
Oh, is it 4.05 or 6, whichever the
I
one
have
is.
6 more minutes.
Yeah, okay, but you're raising a fantastic point, then the responsibility becomes. They are vulnerable to research, it's greater than minimal risk, right? And so. What protections are we putting in, or can't the research be done?
Yeah, I mean, I've also been,
Not being able to waive parental permission. I mean, you need to really.
Right, that's right.
On this, I'm.
yeah, I've also been wondering, are there ways, creative ways of doing data, of collecting data in the sense that we have. Like, our regular, the way we, collect it, and then maybe you have a side, completely anonymous study, but it carries enough data here so you can analyze that. I mean, maybe we need to get a little bit more creative in thinking about, okay, certain things, we're gonna keep that anonymous in the study, but it can carry over enough stuff that we can analyze the data appropriately. I don't know, I'm always wondering, like, sometimes can we do some data analysis tools?
One thing, one recommendation. And I'm jumping ahead to your manuscript. But I think if there are limitations to your study design, like you couldn't ask this or this, or you had to be anonymous because of this or this. Or whatever the other
However you,
changes to your ideal study design, I think. This is the activist part of me, and I think that we need to be putting that in the limitations of our study.
yeah,
Because of the legal limitations on the design,
That's a great point.
and I think I think that's important.
yeah, I mean, that's the only way when something is happening to us under research, the only really way it get documented is if it's put into the publication, right? Or someone call you doing an MRP and ask you a question.
So I
No
think
one has mentioned
discussion
that.
limitations.
I love that, but
Yeah.
I think we should also put it into the method section, because most people never read the limitation section, because it's always blah, 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 blah. So, but I totally agree with you, we've got to make it.
Wherever.
I totally agree, it's a great
We
point.
need to be documenting the limits.
It's also gonna go into grants, because then it comes in front of a review committee, NIH people hear that.
Yes.
It becomes something that you hear about, and it gets into the policy work that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of
that's
the,
great.
I don't know if this is me just being overly worried, as we talk about, putting things in the informed consent, letting our participants know, think about Lloyd, which, mentioned, like, they're already, there's already a lot of risk in our population's lives. Are we also, by putting this in the consent or talking a little bit more about it, are we running the risk that participants won't join studies of fear? Like, so let's say you're a parent. No one's doing parents. Oh, actually, yeah. But let's say that you're a parent and you have a child which is getting gender affirming care. Would you be like, oh, something, maybe I don't do research because I fear that they may find out, I may let it slip or something. I don't know. I mean, I wonder, like, while we also are trying to inform, let's not do the sky is falling too, like, really, like, think about what the risk and the benefits are, not all the hypothetical ones, like, what's the practical ones? That's just my view a little bit, but. I was thinking about it on you. Okay.
we already kind of talked about this. I thought they were less obvious, but they apparently aren't because they came out very quickly. But thinking about the impact that this may have on our research topics and even the questions that we ask and research areas that we think about getting into and collaborations we think of doing. I mean, I'm guilty always of saying like, I don't do adolescent. I started adolescent research. I love adolescent research. I'm like, it's just such a hard population to work with. And it's just like, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. But, definitely I'm not getting ready to do it right now. But, thinking about how this could limit research topics and questions, but also, thinking about research methodologies. Maybe this is good, maybe this is bad, but, I do clinical research and every single time everyone gets a pregnancy test, right? And it was just like part of the standard screening. And now we've been saying, we don't need that. Like, unless they're getting medication or certain medications, we don't need to know if someone is pregnant. We don't need to do a pregnancy test. But also asking about pregnancy on surveys. And then thinking about, we used to think about like just kind of some of the issues with international collaborations and working in hostile government areas. But we have to think about interstate, hopefully funding. I'm on intramural, but I do wonder, like, as the political scene change, are we going to see changes in funding like we did with gun violence? Initially we studied gun violence and then there was a literal like no
30
data,
years of no study.
no 30 years of no study and no data being collected. Are we going to get there? And also being very concerned about the physical and emotional attacks to researchers which are doing this research.